Shabbat Shalom. So for those who are calendar watchers, much like train spotters, but watching the Jewish calendar as it goes through, you know that we are in the middle of a very interesting time of the year, known as the 3 weeks. We stand between the fast of Tammuz, which took place last week, and we are heading towards Rosh Chodesh Av, the beginning of the new month of Av next week, and then Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, following in the week after. All of this surrounds our mournfulness for the destruction of the 2 temples of Jerusalem. The first in 586 by the Babylonians, the second by the Romans in 70 CE. These destructions were catastrophic, to say the least, not just because of the loss of property, the loss of the Temple of Jerusalem, but because of the mass destruction and exile to our people and the almost complete collapse of the Jewish society, which took many decades and indeed centuries to fully be rebuilt and to continue on with strength once more. And so we set aside time each year during the different other fast days. More can be found in my most recent YouTube on the Pathways to Judaism course, to mourn those catastrophes. Indeed, when it comes to Tisha B'Av, it is the most mournful day in the entire Jewish year. We sit on the floor, we read from the Book of Lamentations from Eicha, we of course engage in a fast where we abstain from food and drink and other forms of either enjoyment or activities that might distract us from the sadness that we should feel. We truly push ourselves to be the most lamenting that we can be for what we have lost. But is that really the correct way to live? Is that really what Judaism asks us to do? Is there a point where we go too far? We just sang in the Haggadah, "Too long have you sat in the valley of tears. Arise from the ashes, arise and wear your clothes again, to be glad, to be happy." It seems as though Judaism is, as it is in many places, of 2 minds about how we remember the past that causes us pain. On the one hand, we seem to have enshrined it and almost demanded sadness, and on the other hand, it seems as though we try to put it to one side and move past the past. This is something that we have wrestled with, and so have other nations and other cultures. We can see that there are many people around the world who mourn what they consider to have been the glory days of their past empires and countries. We only need to look to the history of the 20th century to see the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy as being corresponding to the longing for the mythical empires that they each wished to be part of once again. The Grand Reich of Germany, the Grand Empire of Rome. And we can see the fascism that came from that desire. We can see from the French and the British how they tried to doggedly cling to the empires that they still possessed after World War I and after World War II, fighting colonial wars to prevent the independence of those parts of their empire. And how once they had lost those holdings, many people in the country fell into a almost fitful malaise, wondering what their place in the world would be now that they were no longer the head of these vast global empires. Time and time again, in country after country, you will always find people who believe that the best days were in the past and who mourn for what was once their greatest moments. And yes, even among some Jews, you will find people who long for the life of the shtetl, the life of Eastern Europe before the Holocaust, before the pogroms. You will find some people who long for the days of the Solomonic Empire, the great conquests under King Solomon, where the empire of Israel was expanding. You will find people who still remember the great building phase of American Judaism, when massive institutions and massive edifices were being put up throughout large Jewish cities in this country. And many believe that all of these represent some high watermark that is now gone and for which we should mourn. But this is not the way Judaism tells us to mourn. Yes, it tells us to mourn, but not to mourn what was once our greatest moment, but to mourn the devastation that came at that moment, and more importantly, to learn from it. Judaism doesn't tell us to forget the past. God forbid, we are a very historical people. We are driven by the story of our past, but we are driven forward by the story of our past, not backwards. When we weep for the destruction of Tisha B'Av, for the destruction of the temples and the other catastrophes that have befallen our people on that day throughout the last few thousand years, we are not weeping because those days were better than now. We are weeping because there was such pain on that day, and we must remember it so that we can make it have value and worth to be able to reach beyond. When we look backwards, we are looking at it as a reminder of how we should live today and what we should be seeking for tomorrow. Too often people want to pretend as though the past never happened and turn away from it and forget the wisdom that was there and the wisdom that is found even in the darkest moments. And too often others wish to turn to the past and live there. We're forgetting that those wonderful days at the shtetl were anything but wonderful, when our people were oppressed from both without and within by different structures. People who believed that the 50s and 60s in America were the best years of American Jewish life have no idea that we are experiencing a renaissance at this day. And those who think that was the high point only because we built the largest buildings forget that the true monument to Judaism is in the spirit, not in the stone. And those who think that the days of the Solomonic Empire were our best clearly have never turned the page to the chapter after Solomon when he died and left it to his son, and the people came begging for relief. For them, Solomon's empire was no joy and was no blessing. And unfortunately, his son's refusal to change his father's ways led us into a civil war and divided our kingdom. We must learn from these moments even as we sit and weep. We must learn from these moments so that we can avoid their mistakes. And we will make our own mistakes. And then one day we will look back on our own follies and learn from them, even as we shed a tear, and our children will hopefully be able to go even further. There is an understanding in Jewish law that those who come later are the ones who decide how we should be following halakha. Halakha tibatrei, as it says in the Gaonim, in the words of the sages after the closing of the Talmud. For only those who come next have the wisdom of both those who came before and their own generation. We must enshrine that wisdom of the past and use it for us now and use it to build tomorrow. We must continue to weep and we must continue to look forward with hope. We must remember that the past is gone, but that we stand on its shoulders, not so that we can duplicate it, but that so we can surpass it. Shabbat Shalom.